One of my favorite parts about the Hebrew Bible is seeing how interconnected everything is. If anyone's ever had a fun time doing Bible studies or reading a commentary and you see people make a connection, it's just the light bulb goes off. It's such a fun experience. And if you love that feeling, you're going to love today's interview. We have Dr. Joanna Kline with us today, and she, in fact, did her entire PhD dissertation on this concept, the idea that things are connected. But she connected some stories I've never seen anyone connect before. And I think it's going to be really fun for us to discuss. But first, let's start with our guest that we have, Dr. Joanna Kline. Thank you so much for joining me and Dr. Nathan French on the podcast.
It's great to be here.
So first, I would love for you just to introduce yourself to us and to our listeners. Maybe someone isn't familiar with you or your work. Maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself, where you teach, and how you got into biblical studies.
Sure. I teach at Gordon College in Wenham, Massachusetts. I went here as an undergrad also. I was interested in the Bible ever since I was a kid. I was definitely a reader. I just love reading stories. And so the Bible was part of that. So I made it a goal to read through the Bible starting when I was in third grade. It took me till I was in sixth grade to read through the whole thing. And some parts I got bogged down a little bit, but I did make it through. I just always loved stories, especially Judges was a favorite book of mine when I was a kid. And, sometimes obscure corners of the Bible. So one time I wrote a story about my friends and me putting us back in Bible times and in light of the purity regulations in Leviticus 15. So I've always, sort of liked exploring some of those lesser known parts of the Bible, but also narratives. So at Gordon, I ended up being a Bible and English major, double major in keeping with those major interests of mine. And I didn't really know that I was going to end up in academia. I taught English in Russia for a couple of years. I worked in nonprofit for a little bit, but eventually I really decided I did want to go into this field. Applied to master's programs, and just as I was looking at different programs in Bible and comparative literature and even Russian, it just became clear to me that I really did want to go the Old Testament route and study Bible with a kind of literary angle. And through my programs, I also became really interested in interpretation of the Bible and how it was interpreted, especially in ancient times, early Judaism, and Christianity in the New Testament, but other things like Dead Sea Scrolls and rabbinics, and how biblical texts were interpreted in the process of them coming together into the Bible too, what some people call interbiblical interpretation, which is sort of relevant to my project that I'll be talking about. So I would say, narrative is a huge interest to me. Wisdom literature also I've always been into, and history of interpretation.
What an origin story for a biblical scholar. I mean, this picture of a third grader reading Judges.
Judges is her favorite book. Yeah, that's great.
So fascinating. We just recently did an episode on Samson and Judges. Such a fun book too. Yeah. I really enjoy that.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So would you say that, what is your main passion in the field? Would you say it is sort of narrative study or hermeneutics? That's sort of the sense I'm getting, yeah?
Yeah. It's hard to narrow it down. There's so many things.
Right.
But I would say probably literary approaches to the Bible would be a major interest, and early interpretation, if I had to maybe pick the top two.
Excellent. Good. Do you find that your students like it?
Those kinds of approaches?
Yeah.
I haven't gotten to teach a class purely on either of those things, but I would say I work them into all my classes. And students are usually interested when you bring in something they've never seen, like rabbinic midrash or something that really, it can be a little bit hard to access and understand when you're first reading it. And some people are surprised or just kind of baffled. But as you get into it, a lot of people can delight in it and find it interesting.
Yes, excellent.
It's true. I mean, it's definitely. I remember the first time I was exposed to rabbinic midrash, and I just thought, like, where are we going? This isn't Kansas anymore. What's happening? And in fact, Dr. French, I feel like isn't one of the things you do in one of your classes is the the article about is the fish in Jonah.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, my Dr. Mutter, right? My doctoral supervisor, Lena Sophia Tiemeyer, Professor Lena Sophia Tiemeyer, teaching at Öreberg in School of Theology in Sweden now. She has an article in Vetus Testamentum called the grammatical sex of Jonah's fish, because it goes from a dog to a daga, and so she has all this sort of history of interpretation, then presents her own conclusions to why we have a hey on the end of that of the dog. But she talked about Rashi there at one point, and so I really hit my research students who are just coming into theology. I make them read this article to really see how interpretation really works. But Rashi's interpretation was great. It was that he was in the male fish, I think, and was perfectly comfortable being there. So the Lord sent a female fish and got Jonah into the female fish, and the female fish was pregnant, and all the little babies were in there. And of course, Jonah became sort of annoyed, and he knelt down and prayed at that point, if you will. So it's just, what these these medieval exegetes came up with is just fantastic. So
let's dive into your research, and I think it'd be helpful if we first just talk about the general principle that you're applying when we have narrative analogy. And so I wonder if you can break down, what is this? And I think it's fair first off to say it's a niche within this idea of making connections. People maybe have heard the words allusions, references. What's narrative analogy? How does it play into the conversation of when people are making connection between narratives in the Bible?
Yeah, so you're right that it is kind of a sub thing within allusion more broadly, and obviously something that happens in narratives, not just any text. So it's when a narrative in a way kind of builds up this comparative structure that enables you to compare it with another narrative in the Bible. So a lot of times it would be done through maybe a series of similar plot points, plot parallels, sometimes similar language or keywords or images or motifs. And it allows you to look at one story in light of another. So there has to be some series of similarities, really, I think, for a narrative analogy to work, for you to notice the connections between one narrative and another. But usually there's significant differences too, and that's part of the point, is looking at, how does one story compare to another, and what does that say about the characterization of the characters in the story? What does it say about maybe the themes that are being developed or the theology of the text?
So on that note, I have maybe a question we can jump right into. We use words. You'd mentioned interbiblical interpretation. Do you think you could unpack that a little bit, how that works? And, I've heard things like allusion, echo. Maybe unpack some of these words for us and what they mean, and maybe some of the methodology behind that.
Yeah, so people use interbiblical interpretation to talk about a text that eventually ended up in a canonical Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. Well, you could talk about it with the New Testament as well. But a text that ended up in the Bible, commenting on, interpreting, exegeting, or somehow interacting with another text that ended up in the Bible. Sometimes in some of these cases, people really want to establish which text came first, and then which text was alluding to that text, because sometimes that can have implications for the meaning or the purpose of the allusions. With narrative analogy, I do try to engage in that conversation in my project some, more as kind of a historical question of, how might these texts have come together over time. But I think with these narratives that are eventually coming together in, you could call it the Ennead, like Genesis through Kings, into this one history of Israel, it's somewhat less important to untangle some of those dynamics, because some of this probably shaping and textual interaction happened, the texts were maybe mutually influencing each other, or it happened on kind of levels where all these texts were being put together into one history. That's what I think, at least. And so they were probably meant to be read alongside of each other. So I think in terms of narrative analogy, how it can be different sometimes than some studies on allusion or echoes. Some of those, it's really important to look for particular verbal expressions that echo other ones that are unique. And those also play a role in narrative analogy, and they help. But because narrative analogy is working on a little bit of a bigger scale, not just kind of, one verse alluding to another verse, maybe it's working on the level of whole narratives, that it has, I think, more to do with the kind of density of plot parallels and things like that. And so it's helpful if you see a unique phrase echoed in one narrative and another, to establish that there's an analogy there. And you do see that in the examples that I treat, but it has to do more, I think, in narratives with this density of plot parallels, especially, that can help build up an analogy.
Yeah, fascinating. Good.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think about allusion. My main research has been Proverbs 1-9. And there are a couple of times there's some interesting allusion there, like whether the tree of life is mentioned explicitly, or there's an interesting potential allusion to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they'll eat the fruit of their way, but it's not on any level a narrative analogy because it's not that extensive. And this is where what you're looking into with narrative analogy, there's a lot, it's much more intense. There's a lot more going on to this. So I think there's a lot more that needs to then be explained about this. There's a lot more to dig up and to research with this. So let's just go ahead and dive into, you compared some characters and stories. I haven't heard a lot of people compare. My father-in-law, he used to be a Bible teacher in a high school. He's a pastor now, but he used to take some of his high school students through this course where he basically compared Jesus to Joseph and spent weeks going through this, right? So I've heard this before. Or in the New Testament studies, you'll see people talk about Matthew wants to show that Jesus is a new Moses, and there are these comparisons. But interestingly, you compare some of the patriarchal era people to David. So I would love for you to maybe set up what's the general connection you see. Maybe start walking us through. Again, this is your PhD dissertation. There's no way we're going to be able to cover everything, but maybe some things you want to share, and we can kind of just go back and forth with some questions as you walk us through your research.
Sure. So yeah, this is one that it can be harder for readers to notice because it is separated by such a lot of text, Genesis to Samuel. And that's why I think, some general readers or scholars don't notice some of these connections. There has been work done on it, and especially the kind of maybe classical modern model of these connections was to posit that there was some kind of connection between the succession narrative and the Pentateuchal J source, the Yahweh source. Then they both came out of this same kind of Solomonic era milieu, and they were related. So I deal with that a little bit, but I think the connections actually go much beyond, what people call the succession narrative and what people call J, which of course both are very debated now, what those actually are and if they exist. So there are a lot of connections, and I think it makes sense to see David and his family as connected with Jacob and his family at the outset, because obviously there's a genealogical connection from Jacob to Judah, his son, and then David is their descendant. So right off the bat, they're part of one family, and that's important. But what I do in my project is I look at two parts of the David story that really seem to have a lot of connections with the narratives in Genesis, especially about Jacob and his family. So focusing on the beginning of the David story, 1 Samuel 16-19. So when David is anointed, David and Goliath story, and then parts of the narratives about his relationship with Saul. And then, so that's kind of one complex. And then the other one that I treat especially closely is 1 Samuel 11-13. So David and Bathsheba, and then Amnon and Tamar's story that follows that. So in both of these complexes, you can see David compared especially with Joseph and Jacob, also Judah in the second one. And in the first group of stories at the beginning of the David story, the comparisons are mostly positive. So David is compared positively with these characters. I'll talk about some of those details. And then the connections turn a little bit negative and darker in those more negative stories about David and 2 Samuel. So at the beginning of the story, David has a lot of similarities kind of on a a general level with Joseph. So he's youngest son. Joseph is almost the youngest. He's a shepherd. He's handsome. And his father, well, both Joseph and David get this somewhat ambiguous sign at the beginning of the stories about them, that they're going to have some kind of rule or authority. So for Joseph, it's the dreams. For David, it's the anointing by Samuel. But in both cases, you don't actually see that really come to fruition or be fulfilled until much later in the story. So that's true for both of them.
Interesting.
And then both of them get sent by their fathers towards the beginning of their stories. They get sent on an errand by their fathers to check on their brothers. For Joseph, this obviously kicks off, the huge drama of the narrative, where his brothers sell him into slavery and he ends up in Egypt. But for David, he doesn't have as big of a conflict with his brothers. He gets sent to the battlefield where they're facing off with the Philistines. He does have a little bit of an argument with his brother, but it's not as big as we see in the Joseph story. But just like Joseph, he never goes back home after that. He ends up in the court of a ruler, rises to success because God is with him. So a lot of similarities with what happens to Joseph in Egypt. And so right at the beginning of the stories, it seems like there's just a lot of similarities between Joseph and David. And then as you go on in that beginning part of the David story, you see a lot of similarities between David and Jacob, especially in terms of their relationship with their father-in-laws, so Saul and Laban. So for example, they both have these negotiations with their future fathers-in-law over two daughters, an older and a younger daughter. So for Jacob, it's Rachel and Leah. He wants to marry Rachel. Laban, he works for 7 years. Laban deceives him and gives him Leah, and then he has to work then he gets to marry Rachel, but has to work for another 7 years. With David, these stories are a little bit easier to overlook, but there's a part in 1 Samuel 18 where Saul says he's going to give David Merab, his daughter Merab, his older daughter. But then it's not really explained, but it says when it was time for David to marry her, Saul gave her to someone else. So just like Laban, he seems to kind of go back on these negotiations. Then the younger daughter gets brought in. And so Saul says that David can marry his younger daughter, Michal, if he goes and gruesomely gets 100 Philistine foreskins. So David does that, but he actually gets 200 according to the Masoretic text. It's 100 in the Septuagint. But so just like Jacob kind of interestingly has to double his service from 7 years to 14 years, David ends up doubling the bride price, kind of the service from 100 to 200 Philistine foreskins. But both of them have this kind of, strained would be putting it gently, relationship with their fathers-in-law. So, they both end up having to run away, and their wife or wives, support them versus the father. So Jacob gets Rachel and Leah's support. They leave. Laban and Rachel steals these teraphim and lies to her father about them. These household idols or something like that. David has to flee from Saul because Saul wants to kill him. Michal helps David and lies to Saul. She hides a teraphim dummy in a bed to trick Saul that it's David that's sick in bed, and she lies to her father-in-law about that and helps David get away. They both meet up again. Jacob and Laban, Saul and David, they have a conversation about their relationship. They both make a this agreement about how they're going to treat each other and their daughters in the future, at least with Laban. And then there's kind of an interesting twist, I think, in 1 Samuel 25 in this confrontation between David and Nabal, where David actually becomes a kind of Esau figure rather than Jacob. There's a lot of parallels between that scene and Jacob and Esau meeting up. Esau's bringing 400 men, David's bringing 400 men.
Interesting.
And so Abigail becomes kind of the Jacob figure in that one.
That's super interesting because in that story too, David is almost depicted as the most just acting on his instincts, very aggressive, and he's almost I imagine like someone, a wrestler in a ring, having to get held back, right? Like,
yeah, right.
You know,
in a great contrast to 1 Samuel 24 and 26, that sandwich that story where he shows this enormous amount of restraint,
right?
And he has this chance to take Saul's life, who, you know, Saul's trying to kill him, he doesn't. And then this big contrast in that middle chapter where he's willing to kill a man and all the guys in his household over an insult, basically.
And Abigail's the one who restrains, right? She's the wisdom in that story. It's very interesting. Yeah. So yeah. So on that note, I was pulling up here your dissertation because I was reading. I had read this line, and I thought that this was fascinating. It's a question I have for you, and maybe I don't know if you've thought much on it. So if you don't want to go into great detail on it, don't worry about that. But it says here, scholars who use a literary approach generally discuss the function of analogies on the level of the narrative itself, rather than identifying a historical situation that motivates the parallels. And I think our listeners might already be having this on the back of their minds somewhat. So obviously, all these parallels that we're going through, how do we think about sort of a narrative action on a textual literary level, and something that that many want to think is historical, right? Yeah. So we're seeing these parallels. Did you think about that much in your dissertation? Was that something that you covered, or?
Yeah, you're talking about this tension between kind of literary shaping and then interpretation of historical events.
Right.
Yeah. It's something that I kind of deliberately bracketed in my dissertation. But it's something that I've definitely thought about. And yeah, I think, you know, when you hear about some literary shaping or editorial things or, you know, text developing over time, it does definitely bring up questions about historicity, of course. I would say that in general, I don't see literary approaches. I think they're compatible with historical approaches. Even though sometimes if people hear story or narrative or literary artistry or something, they hold that in kind of opposition to history. But I think anybody who writes history, even today, people writing historical works are going to be selective. Everybody's selective in what they write about. Even today, people use analogies a lot in history to understand history. You know, we think about the COVID pandemic in light of the 1918 flu pandemic, or, you know, wars or conflicts in terms of patterns with other ones to try to understand our present situation. We often think in terms of, you know, how is this similar to things in the past and how is it different from things in the past? So even today, we do that, I think, in history writing. And if you look at, you know, or a documentary or something like that, they're selecting certain things to talk about and talking about them in certain ways. And I do think that we need to distinguish what we see as history and history writing also, even though there's some similarities with what we have in the Bible, which, you know, I don't think we need to hold to the same kind of standards as a newspaper reporter or something like that. So that's one thing. But another thing is that, you know, the biblical authors, even if they're presenting something that's historical, they're choosing certain things. They're also choosing certain words to use when other words could be used, maybe, and that might signal connections and things like that. So I don't think that, even though I didn't focus on this really in my project on, you know, what's historical versus not historical or something like that, I don't think that any of these things have to be seen in opposition to history or that they're not historical because they're literary. So I think there are ways of representing history in terms of shaping and stuff that could be, you know, representing things that happened, but choosing to present certain episodes and not others, choosing to use certain words or phrases and not others that would help highlight some of these similarities.
Excellent. Yeah, it's very good. That'll be very helpful, I think, for some of our listeners to think about some of that moving forward. And that's a very good point too. I think on just a sort of natural level, we do this all the time, don't we? We like to situate ourselves to understand and explain what is happening or what has happened, even in our lives, or just on a more macro level in history general proper. So.
Yeah, one thing I think about as a brief contemporary example that I want to go back to, something that Nathan's question reminded me for your research, is that Michael Jordan documentary came out probably a couple of years ago during the pandemic, and it was about a season that happened in the 90s, and they were sitting on this documentary footage for at least a couple decades, and they weren't doing anything with this. They knew at some point they were going to make a show about Michael Jordan, but they were sitting on it until it finally got the go. And some people think that, right as LeBron James is maybe becoming, some people are debating, hey, maybe he's actually the best player of all time. Michael Jordan may be in the background saying, hey guys, go ahead, go for it. And so it's not that the story of Michael Jordan isn't true by any means. All this stuff happened. This is all documentary. They do interviews, everything. But maybe they choose, you can only tell a documentary for so long, right? Like, how many Michael Jordan stories can you put into one series? How many stories of David can you share? But if you're telling it at a certain time in history, like when LeBron's around, there might be certain stories you include or not. This might be a bad analogy. Again, I don't want to compare modern history telling to, again, ancient Israel, but at least trying to give another contemporary example that people realize, again, that doesn't mean there's something disingenuous going on here.
Correct.
So question I asked that's kind of in line of this, I found your David and Goliath chapter very interesting when you compare Masoretic text to one of the Septuagint manuscripts. Was it Sinaiticus, Vaticanus? I can't remember which one it is. But anyway, I found this first off very interesting because looking at Septuagint, I remember when I first started learning about this, for some reason, the people I was around, they always gave me really bad examples, like, oh, here's a huge difference. And I'm like, okay, great. You're not motivating me to learn Septuagint Greek very well. But you give a fascinating example where you look at a version of the sequences leading up to and through the fight between David and Goliath, as it's presented in one of the major Septuagint codices, as well as the one that we have in the Masoretic text. And so, again, not to put you so much on the spot because you have a huge dissertation. We weren't planning on asking you this. I was curious if you maybe want to talk a little bit about this as a microcosm example of Nathan's questions when it comes to selective use of scenes.
That'd be good.
Yeah. So what I noticed when I was looking at 1 Samuel 17 and 18, and this is one place in the Bible where you do have a big difference in Septuagint version and Masoretic text, where this Septuagint version is much shorter. And the Masoretic text version has some major pluses vis-a-vis the Masoretic text. So people debate which one is the original one, if you can call it that. Is it the shorter? Is it the longer one? Did a longer text get abbreviated? Did a shorter one get expanded? I think for various reasons that it's more likely that a shorter text got expanded. And what's relevant to my project is that when you look at a lot of these pluses in MT, the stuff that's additional vis-a-vis the Greek text, a lot of what I was seeing of the analogies are on that level. So in the Septuagint, you don't have the story about David being sent by his father to his brothers. So that's part of that. That part. There's also, besides the David and Goliath story, the part about Merab, David's the possibility of marriage to Merab in 1 Samuel 18 is not there in the Septuagint. That's a plus. And then also slightly less relevant for my project, but the scene with David and Jonathan where they make a covenant together, and also one of the spear throwing scenes where Saul throws a spear at David is not there. So anyway, a lot of these connections that I saw were on the level of these pluses. And so I wondered if maybe this was evidence that some of these analogies grew stronger over time. So maybe, David was originally presented as similar to Joseph and Jacob in similar ways, but that as these stories grew up over time, that David became even more analogically similar. And, there may have, who knows how many traditions there were out there about David and why authors included certain ones. And, I can't make a lot of, I can't come to an absolute conclusion about where this material came from. In the pluses, was it an independent source, or was it always composed with the wider narrative in mind? But it is interesting, I think, that a lot of those analogical connections in that section come in those pluses. And so I do think it may be likely that some of these analogies over time were strengthened. And that might be the case with other parts of the David story, but we just don't see the evidence as obviously. We don't have such a control that we have with these two different versions in the Septuagint and the Masoretic text that we have for that particular part of the story.
It's fascinating. Yeah. Because it is a good point that as texts are growing, the analogies can just get greater and greater. I mean, you could expect that to be the case. So that's such a nice example. I was going to ask you about the David story, especially because there are some fascinating correlations that you're making there with Joseph, with 2 Samuel 11 through 13, especially, right. And then what we have with Potiphar's wife. And Joseph as well, and then of course, when you move into Tamar, right, with Genesis 39 as well, I think that's all fascinating. So, tell us a little bit about that. Actually,
yeah. So there's a lot going on in this section, but with regard to David and Bathsheba story, I argue that it's a kind of mirror image of the Joseph and Potiphar's wife. So you've had David set up as this, Joseph-like ruler in really positive ways in 1 Samuel. And then you get to this moment in 2 Samuel 11 where David fails in kind of the inverse of how Joseph succeeded. Yeah. And also the contrast between the positions of power that they're in or not in those stories, I think also serves to show how terrible what David did was in his adultery with Bathsheba, because Joseph was in this really marginal, position as a slave in Potiphar's house, and he really suffers consequences from his turning down the advances of Potiphar's wife. She frames him, and he goes to jail. So he's in this really vulnerable position, and yet he still refuses to have sex with his Potiphar's wife because he knows that it's wrong. Whereas David is in this absolutely, completely powerful position, and he goes out of his way to commit adultery with this person that he knows is married. Uriah is the one actually who becomes a kind of Joseph figure in that story, because just like Potiphar's wife kept heckling Joseph over and over, and he kept turning her down and saying, no, this would be wrong. It's like that with David also. So David's trying to get Uriah to go home and be with his wife to cover this up, and Uriah just keeps turning him down because he thinks that's wrong. And Uriah obviously suffers consequences for that. And so I think seeing these, especially after all these positive comparisons between David and Joseph in 1 Samuel, it makes this scene even more tragic in how it plays out in 2 Samuel, and David kind of, failing exactly where you could see Joseph succeeding. And then 2 Samuel 13 has some really interesting stuff related to the Joseph story too, where you could argue that David's daughter Tamar becomes this kind of tragic Joseph figure. They're the only two characters who wear this ketonet pasim, the long sleeve garment, or the coat of many colors. Sometimes it's translated differently in the two texts, so you could miss it if you're reading an English translation. But that they're the only two figures that have a coat like that. It's plays a role in their favored status. It's what Joseph gets from his father because his father loves him. It says for Tamar that's the kind of garment that the virgin daughters of the queen or the king wore. So it's kind of a sign of her favored status. And in this scene with her brother Amnon, he says, lie with me, which is exactly what Potiphar's wife says to Joseph, just the difference in the masculine and feminine endings on that. And also Amnon says, send everyone out from me. This phrase, send everyone out from me, which is the same thing that Joseph says to his everybody when he's just about to reveal himself to his brothers. Robert Alter has pointed out that these distinctive locutions occur in reverse order in the Tamar story versus the Joseph story. And so and you also have this situation of sibling rivalry after the rape of Tamar, because Absalom kills Amnon because of this. So you have this kind of reverse trajectory where the Joseph story goes from sibling rivalry to reconciliation. And in the David story, it goes from, kind of an okay situation to one of sibling murder and just an ultimate picture of unreconciliation with rape and murder happening right in David's house, which eventually I think kind of also leads to Absalom's revolt, and eventually you see this tension on kind of a kingdom level too, with Sheba's revolt and the intertribal tensions as well. So it's a kind of, in a way, a kind of Joseph story in reverse. There's a lot going on, but David also plays a similar role to Jacob that Jacob played in Genesis 34, the story of the rape of Jacob's daughter Dinah, where Jacob is silent, and the full brothers are the ones who take retribution on this town because of the rape. And similarly, David is silent when his daughter is raped, and the full brother of the sister Absalom is the one who takes retribution, murders his brother. So there's a lot going on there, and interesting connections with Genesis 38, another Tamar character. So there's a lot of interesting connections there. One thing that's interesting is that you see both Judah and David having this illicit sexual relationship. Judah sleeps with Tamar, his daughter-in-law. He doesn't recognize her. He thinks he's sleeping with a prostitute. And that leads to the birth of these twins, the continuation of his family line, including Perez, who's the descendant of, or the ancestor of David. So it's the story that shows how, Judah's line is in peril, and yet through this very sketchy circumstance, this really important heir is born. And likewise, David, through this terrible sin with Bathsheba and murdering Uriah, he ends up marrying Bathsheba and she gives birth to Solomon, this really important heir of David. So I think you see in both of these stories this terrible situation that nevertheless God seems to be working through to continue these family lines and bring them important descendants.
Yeah.
So many connections.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. And interestingly, not identical. I mean, the connections are amazing, but such different stories on one level too. And that's why I think your work is so fascinating, because it really puts language to the methodology needed to sort of make these connections. And I just found that extremely helpful. I'm currently writing an article on the David story and the Joseph story, looking at how Tov Ra, good and evil, play in both of those stories in light of divine retribution. So this is going to be very helpful for me.
Oh, good.
But now that you mentioned that too, about your connection between Joseph and David, I thought, wow, this is really nice, because really we have two stories on a macro level of wisdom. Mati, you'll like this too, with all your work on wisdom. But if you think about it, I mean, Joseph definitely follows through with wisdom all the way to the end, doesn't he? I mean, he even doesn't bring retribution on his brothers. He is able to see what God is doing in the midst. But David in 1 Samuel 6. With the Ark of the Covenant that he's bringing up, right? Uzziah reaches out his hand, he dies. David becomes angry, and then Mati, what is it? 1 Samuel 6, 9. I don't know. I forget the verse, but it says that David becomes afraid of the Lord, that he becomes Uriah Adonai. And at that point, it's as if David becomes wise, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And from that point forward, David implements wisdom to get the ark where it needs to get to. He has, it seems the priests are carrying it. It seems that he's wearing the ephod when he's dancing now, right? These sorts of things. But then there's a complete collapse of wisdom when we get here to 2 Samuel 11.
Yeah.
And it's detrimental to the rest of his life. And like you said, Solomon ends up on the throne, who some have said is maybe even more the child of Uriah than of David, in a sense, right? You see this in other ways. So anyways, I found your dissertation very helpful to really put good language to that narrative comparative work. So
good.
Yeah.
Before we go to kind of like some final analysis, let's say, like the results of your research, what you see of how do these connections of narrative analogy impact our interpretation? I want to ask a more general question to you. I'm sure everyone's minds are being blown right now as they listen to you making all these wonderful connections, and they're getting excited to read the Bible again, or they're motivated to keep at it with their intense research that they're doing. One of the questions that I have for you is, as you're presenting all this stuff, right, we're realizing, hey, we're reminded about the intentionality of the authors and editors of redactors of Scripture, of the Hebrew Bible, what they're putting together. I wonder if you can speak to two different types of people in our audience. One is the type of person who they're either aspiring to or are doing the academic type of research. Second type of person who's not doing academic research, but they really care about their personal study of Scripture.
Mhm.
I wonder if you can give just a few maybe tips or thoughts or maybe cautions for people as they go about trying to take this literary approach to the Hebrew Bible and making connections like this. Do you have thoughts for those two different types of people?
Sure. Yeah, I think nothing can beat just being immersed in the text and reading a lot and close reading, because you're not going to see it if you don't read it. So that's just at the very basic level. And I think, a lot of times I dealt with a more large scale parallel or, distant textual parallels. A lot of times these analogies come in closer texts, the texts that are closer to each other. So, the patterns in Genesis are pretty obvious to people, the younger surpassing the elder and things like that. But you get other things like, two near-death stories of Abraham's sons where they almost die in Genesis 21 and 22, Ishmael and then Isaac, that can kind of be read as a pair. Or things like the contrast between Rahab and Achan in the stories about Jericho, the conquest of Jericho at the beginning of Joshua. You have this whole series of surprising contrasts between this Canaanite person who ends up avoiding being wiped out with her family, and an Israelite person who ends up getting destroyed like the Canaanites are supposed to, or the judges. There's interesting kind of keywords and connections and similarities among the judges. So I think sometimes starting with nearby narratives can help, but you can see as you keep reading these longer distance ones too, like mine. I think one thing, like I said, it's important to look for a density of parallels. So you might notice some plot similarity to another one. And then I would say follow that up by looking closely. Are there other parallels? Is there a similar language? Do you see some kind of possible purpose for these narratives being read together? And that can, I think, help see if this is an intentional thing or maybe just a random one-off detail that just happens to be similar. Same with language too. I think you can notice something that's similar language, but if you don't see a whole series of things in the narrative, I think it's probably less likely that there's an intentional connection. And for people who are one resource, just a really intro one, but I think it's really helpful, is the Bible Project. Their series How to Read the Bible has one video called Design Patterns. That's a good one just for a kind of introduction to this idea, I think.
Good. Yeah.
But also just if you reading and commentaries and things like that for people who are going further, or articles, sometimes somebody will notice or mention some kind of connection or similarity, even offhand, if they might not be doing this as a whole project, but they'll mention a similarity in language to another passage or something like that. And some of the details I noticed came from stuff like that, where somebody else had noticed a connection but hadn't really followed it through, and looked more closely at it. So that's a way I think people could go farther.
And that's a great part of original research. When I looked at Proverbs 1-9 and see connections and flow between each of the didactic poems from one to the next, what I found is there are certain scholars that would say, hey, didactic poem 10 seems to have some sort of connection to this one over here. But they wouldn't go anywhere with it, right?
Yeah.
And so even though still the scholarly consensus is generally that there is no structure, order, and flow between all the chapters of 1-9, more and more scholars are seeing something. It's not their primary goal of their research. That's what I've been trying to do, is say, hey, I'm seeing people are talking about these connections. And I see some more of the linguistic intentionality of same Hebrew phrases throughout this. There's a flow of the message going on. So I think there's plenty of work to be done in this type of area. You're doing stuff like this. And so again, we hope that this encourages people in that research space right now, or encourages and inspires people who are on the front end. We have a wide audience of all people from pastors to people who just love doing a lot of personal study, as well as people who are in college, all sorts of people. And we hope it continues to inspire people to join this great conversation. And you're an excellent model of this. Let's do this. Nathan, do you have any other questions before we go to the kind of the end result of our research?
No, I think this has been really an excellent conversation so far. So I think what Dr. Kline's point there is great, and any of our students listening should catch on to this, that when you're following scholars and they're making connections but not following through, you got your research project right there, right? There's your paper that you can go and do, because it's a fun thing to find in the literature when you're seeing the connections, but the follow through isn't there. You're onto something. So very good. So no, let's go ahead and ask these more concluding questions. That'd be great.
Yeah. So I guess, at the end of the day, you see all these connections. And so again, there's probably a lot we could possibly read into this, but for you, what have you found is some of the results of this comparative analogy research?
Yeah, I think on one level, it has a lot to say about characterization. I've touched on that a little bit before. So when you look at, for example, this comparative analogy between David and Jacob towards the beginning of the stories with their relationship with their fathers-in-law. If you look at Jacob, he has this kind of back and forth deceptive relationship with Laban, whereas David is similar in a lot of those points of similarity in his relationship with Saul, but David looks completely innocent. And you can see that just from reading the narrative itself, but I think it's underscored when you compare him with Jacob, who's going back and forth with Laban, and he's a deceptive character himself with his relationship with Esau. And so this kind of innocence of David and uprightness of David is highlighted when you compare him with Jacob. Same with Saul and Laban. Saul looks both more evil than Laban. He's trying to kill David for one thing, and he's also less effective. So Laban's able to actually get some things he wants from Jacob, whereas Saul, for all his murderous intentions, he ends up being completely ineffective. So part of it, I think, is that characterization piece. On a bigger level, I think maybe more important is the development of themes that are really important to the narrative. So you can see like that the idea of measure for measure punishment, for example, is important in both of these narratives. And, Jacob deceives his brother, then he's deceived by Laban. And these things, and he's deceived by his sons in Genesis 34 and again in Genesis 37. So, Jacob has these, he lives his life kind of in some moments of it by deception, and then he is deceived by various characters as it goes on. So you can you see that playing out in his life. You see it with David too. So you can read the whole narrative of the second half of 2 Samuel as basically the consequences of David's sin in 2 Samuel 11. And so these kind of things that David does come back to, on his head in various ways. But I think when you put the narratives together, that theme is strengthened even more when you see that these certain sins that are repeated in the lives of Jacob and his family, sexual sins, violence, deception, you see the same things happening. It's even more tragic in a way that, his descendants are experiencing that too in David's family. But then on a positive side, as I addressed earlier, this idea that God's grace and provision for these families are continuing in the face of all this sin and recompense, that God is still guiding this important family line and bringing good and out of these bad situations. And, I think that's that theme, God's providence or God's grace, you can see obviously in both narratives, but when you put them together with all these connections, it's another way to emphasize a theme like that. And you see it in the continuity of it through their whole family story and the story of Israel.
Yeah, I thought about that. One of the themes you also point out was like the sibling rivalry theme. And it makes sense on the meta narrative of the Hebrew Bible, everywhere from Genesis with the beginnings of the family, all the way through to the division of the kingdom,
right,
at the end of Kings. And so it makes sense again why authors want to make sure we point that out at every level, everyone from the early Genesis families to King David,
right,
and all throughout that. This creates such a world of connections. I think is so
great.
fun. I think you're going to get a lot of people after this episode saying, "Man, I got to read the Jacob story and David story again." I want to go through everything they're seeing. We know you're in the work of publishing your dissertation currently. And so we'll be excited whenever that comes out. More people want to dig into all the details and the footnotes and see all the work you've done. We know this is very, and Nathan can speak to this, how difficult and intense this kind of research is and all the time you committed. So thank you for doing this original research. This is very important work. And we've been very happy to get to have a conversation with you to get more people to hear about the research you're doing in this area. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
So we enjoyed having you on, and maybe in the future we have other research, we'll have you back on again. So
I hope
anyway,
so.
thanks for joining the podcast today.
Thank you.
You.
Yeah.